Welcome back. You're watching Climate Change Perspectives. Daniel, we've got differing views here, and obviously the debate is heating up. And of course, Kumi has very important points that he makes, and the professor's also alluding to the fact that we need to look at today's problems as opposed to problems that could arise in 200 years' time. Give us your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I know what Professor thinks of the Stern report. I think you actually referred to it as idiotic. Excuse me if I misquoted you. But I think some of the issues of defending the future, which Kumi touched on earlier, and the contestation about those who are disclaim the impacts of climate change, and there's a growing trend because we don't have action.
But Kumi, you also alluded to the fact that people are dying today because of climate change. So we are feeling the effects right now.
No, absolutely. And let's just talk about the Arctic.
Yeah.
The South African government is concerned about the Arctic, as many other countries that are particularly on coastal, who have coastal sort of borders, because the Arctic is sort of the refrigerator of the planet. Arctic sea ice melting will contribute to global sea level rise, and we're seeing it already in places like the Pacific, where people are having to be moved to higher ground. The seawater has actually contaminated the water table and so on. These impacts are happening now. And to rely on something like coal, which in addition to the emissions, the social costs of coal is huge health impacts, and it also, the way the water consumption in the coal industry, for example,
and the mining industry
as a whole, is threatening our water table and so on. So I very strongly disagree with the fact that these are impacts that we're only going to see in the future. You know, I was at Copenhagen, right, and I remember this cartoon which said, you know, all these negotiators are biting their fingers and saying, "Oh my God, what if climate change was a hoax and we address it for nothing?" And there was a PowerPoint presentation that said, well, if you did that, the implications would be better air quality, better water quality, more balanced lifestyles, more dependent on renewable sources and so on. So what I would say is, of course, because of climate change, we have to act. But actually, if we look at what is in the best interest for society as a whole, fossil fuels not only damages the environment, but it also has huge social, negative impacts.
But the point is, if the abundance of fossil fuels that we use to generate the power that we require globally, I mean, the question is, where in the equation does our nuclear power fit? And is there a fit for nuclear power? And is South Africa's strategy to go ahead with nuclear power a real, genuine response to reducing the uptake on renewables and reducing the reliance on fossil fuels? On the issue of nuclear, I think you were in some way involved with the nuclear program in South Africa?
I was very early on, yes. I did, one of my doctorates was in nuclear engineering, so I'm fairly familiar with the subject. But the simple fact of the matter is that the IRP 2010 spells out the fact that we need a nuclear component in our energy future. And there's absolutely no doubt about that. They considered very carefully the possibility of doing away with any nuclear in our energy future, and they found they couldn't meet anything like the carbon targets they were setting if they tried to abandon nuclear.
People must ask this question.
Yes.
Right? Ordinary people must ask this question. Why should we be betting on a resource that's finite, oil, coal and gas, or why should we bet on nuclear, which is firstly too expensive, too dangerous, and as a response to climate change will deliver too little, too late if you look at how long it takes to get a plant up and running, and it's going to take much longer now since Fukushima because safety standards are going to be rising and so on. So why should we bet on that when we have not harnessed the full capacity, right, of all the clean renewable energy options that we have on a continent that is so blessed with such large resources? The answer to the question is simple: because of the disproportionate level of influence that these industries have on the political process. In the US, for every member of Congress, there are 3 full-time lobbyists making sure that no legislation goes on. So with nuclear, we think it's a false solution to a real problem, and we don't think that the risks and the costs associated are worth taking. certainly not before we've actually explored all the available renewable
Kumi,
options.
I'd like to draw on an example of what happened in the US, where Jimmy Carter, of course, had solar panels on the White House and then subsequently were taken off by the Reagan administration. Is this pretty much in line with what you're talking about, where you've got lobbyists pushing for a specific oil or gas agenda and not pushing for a renewable energy agenda, and then something perhaps slightly a little bit more warped in a sense, where you've got uranium versus thorium, and both discovered at the same time, but thorium less dangerous, but you can't create nuclear weapons from thorium.
Yeah.
There are solutions on this planet. Is it about private sector? Is it about getting the money from government? Who is to make the first move? Is it government or private sector?
Well, no question, government has to take leadership here. And Professor Lloyd is right in the extent of saying that there is not enough political will to move forward. But actually where he's wrong is that I can show documentary proof where every government in the world, right, through submissions, what they say and so on, actually acknowledges how serious the threat of climate change is. But acknowledging it and then sort of sleepwalking us into a crisis of epic proportions is not leadership. Even in the G20, I was there at the G20, you know, we need our leaders to actually be able to operate at different levels and not doing what we've done in the past, which is keeping all the challenges that humanity faces, poverty, human rights, energy, finance and so on, as standalone. We need to have a way of bringing them together, and if we do that, and if governments exercise their regulatory role, and I'm not talking about like burdensome regulations, because good regulation is not necessarily more regulation, and government has a responsibility to have proper regulation and to create an enabling environment for a clean energy future for this planet.
Yeah, Professor Lloyd, as we approach COP17, you know, a question: where do you see leadership coming from, and how could we probably save COP17 from being a lame duck session in the counts of COPs?
I think that there's very little chance of that actually happening. I've searched very actively to try and find some sorts of ways in which something really productive might come out of COP17. But all I can see is that it is going to be a bitter fight from our side to try and do something to replace Kyoto, to try and get something on the table. We've shown every willingness possible to A, to host it, and B, to put our own house into a position where we can't be criticized by anybody. But in doing that, we've made certain commitments that, if you will recall, at Copenhagen, it was promised that there would be $100 billion a year fund set up to help developing countries such as ourselves do something to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. I see absolutely no hope of that happening. I see absolutely no progress being made towards that, particularly in the present economic climate.
Yeah, I mean, we had Minister Manuel on this program who just submitted the Green Climate Fund, and he walked us through. But where do you see? Do you see hope for COP17?
Well,
and where does it lie?
I think so long as people, I'm talking about people in society, in unions, in religious groups, in NGOs and so on, are not willing to give up hope, we can extract something out of COP. And we need to make sure that COP, in the end, will be known as the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework on Climate Change, and not COP being the conference of polluters, in the sense that the companies that are there are not actually driving the agenda. But practically, we want to get progress, and we want money to be put on the table to fill the fund that has been set up in the tune of 100 billion. We want to get movement on forest protection, which is possible on bunker fuels, aviation and airline and shipping. And we also want to make sure that we can protect Kyoto and lay the foundation for a new, fair, ambitious and legally binding climate treaty to come through.
Kumi, very quickly, isn't supply demand, simple economics, shouldn't the demand come from the people on the ground, globally? Consumers such as myself, making a noise and saying, this is the change that we want. And unless we get that demand, private sector and government is going to continue on the same path.
Correct. That demand is growing significantly. If you think of how many people were talking about climate change 5 years ago, how many people are involved now, it's exponentially rising. Secondly, though, you've got to understand that it's in the interests of the oil, coal and gas companies and certain governments to shroud energy supply in secrecy and to not actually honestly provide to citizens what the alternatives are. That's that's something that we have to continue to do to build momentum. But let us not underestimate the extreme power of the oil, coal and gas industries in actually holding back progress, because there's a huge amounts of money to be made, as we see in the oil industry, and they're going to fight tooth and nail to hang on to those industries. We hope that our governments will have the backbone and the guts to stand up to those industries and secure our children's future.
Okay, we have to wrap it there. I'm so sorry, gentlemen, we have to leave it there, but thank you so very much for this debate. I appreciate it. On that note, we've come to the end of this week's edition of Climate Change Perspectives. A very big thank you to Kumi Naidoo, of course, from Greenpeace, and Professor Philip Lloyd. Until next time, from me, Eleni Jokos and Daniel Kinnear, it's goodbye.